Now let's look at stored procedures in MySQL. So if you've taken CIS 276, you're probably already familiar with the concept, but if you've only taken 275, you may not be. So the idea of a stored procedure is basically just like a function that lives out in the database. And MySQL, like Visual Basic, distinguishes between procedures, which do things but don't necessarily return values, and functions, which always return a single value. So you can actually store procedures and functions in the database instead of having them in your PHP. Now, there are a couple of advantages to doing this. The first advantage is that it further cleans up the separation between the logic and the data layer and the business and application logic that we have in our web server code. And this also makes it easier to write different applications that are all using the same database. The more logic you have in the database that's going to be common across all different applications, the easier it is to reuse that logic. If I have everything embedded in a bunch of PHP code and someone wants to write a mobile app for Android, they're going to have to go into my PHP code and extract the queries and then reformat that to work in Java using connector/j and so on. But if I've moved that logic into the database, then they can write a new Java app for Android without having to go picking through my PHP code. So that's a big advantage in terms of reuse. And then there are some security advantages as well, and we'll see some of those in a while. So let's start by going into phpMyAdmin. So I'm going to go to localhost, phpMyAdmin, and I'm going to go to the share database. And if your screen is sufficiently large, mine isn't because I'm making this video, then at the top you're going to have a tab for routines. If not, then it's going to be in this More drop-down menu. So I have no routines to display, and there's a link for adding a routine. So routine is the MySQL and phpMyAdmin name for stored procedures and stored functions. So let's start with a really simple one. I'm going to add a stored procedure called, let me make this a little bigger, and I'll make this a little smaller. Good. So I'm going to call this test hello, and then this is going to be a function, so it's going to return a value, and then it's not going to take any parameters, so I'm going to drop that. Then here's where I actually put the SQL code that gets executed. So all that this is going to do is return concatenate, and then hello, and a space, and world. So not a very exciting or interesting function. It just returns hello space world, but it's enough to test. And then the return type here, this is going to be a piece of text, so I'm going to change that to varchar, and I'm going to just leave the length unspecified here. So this is how you define the name of the function. If there are parameters, we'll see that in a while. The return type, and then the actual code that gets executed. You can either have a single line of SQL code here, or you can have multiple lines that are blocked by starting with begin and ending with end. And we'll see an example of that later on. And then you have some options that are a little obscure when you're starting out. So the first one is deterministic. Deterministic means that anytime you call this function with the same set of parameters, you're always going to get the same result. So for example, if you had a random number generator or a function that looked at the time, it wouldn't be deterministic, because if you ran the thing twice, you would get two different results. This one always is going to return the same answer. It doesn't take any parameters, and it's always going to return the same value. So I can check is deterministic here. Definer has to do with who's actually creating the stored procedure. Right now I'm logged into phpMyAdmin as root, the admin account, and so by default the definer is going to be root. And that's important because of the security type here. This is the security context in which the stored procedure is run. So when you run this procedure, if this is set to definer, that means the procedure always gets run as if it was admin running it. I can also say invoker, and that means whatever user is logged in and connected to the database, that's the security context this is going to get run in. So this is important because if the invoker doesn't have access to do certain things like drop tables or access data in a particular table or whatever, but the definer does have access to do that, then anybody who can run this stored procedure will be able to have the access that the definer has. But if it's set to invoker, and you try to run the stored procedure and you don't have access to what the stored procedure is doing, you're going to get a security error. So this is a way of controlling access to the database. What I can do is create a user account that basically doesn't have any rights at all to the data, except for the right to run these stored procedures. And then the stored procedures can have a higher level of access and run as definer. So that way I only give the user of the database access to what I've predefined inside of a stored procedure. No direct access to the underlying data in the tables. So this gives you additional security control. I'm going to run this as definer. And then this SQL data access, this is pretty much advisory and it's a little obscure, but basically the way it works is NoSQL is just going to be declares. Contain SQL is going to be SQL statements above declares, usually having to do with transactions and batching, but that don't include select, update, insert, delete, and so on. Then reads are going to be queries that include select statements that read the data. And then modifies are going to be queries that include update, delete, insert, and so on, things that actually write data to the database. And this particular one doesn't have any SQL in it. It's just returning a value, so I'm going to select no SQL here. And once again, this is just advisory. And then I can attach a comment if I want to. So let me go ahead and attach the comment. My test function. And when I hit go here, missing value in form, so I actually do have to specify this length. So I'll say varchar 256 is the type. Okay, so what that form did was it actually created this SQL statement, and let's take a look at it. So create function, name of the function. MySQL uses backticks to quote function names and column names. These are optional here because there are no special characters. Then there's a parameter list. I don't have any parameters here, so it's just open close. Then the body of the stored function, which returns a type. There's a comment, my test function. It's deterministic, no SQL. Then the SQL security is running in the context as definer, and it returns concatenate hello world. So this is the actual body. So you can actually send the SQL command directly to the database from a piece of code, but it's easier to just use the form to define it. So let's go ahead and execute that and see what I get. I'm going to hit execute. So let's go ahead and go to SQL, and let's take a look at how this is actually called. Select test hello. So if I execute that, it's actually concat, I think. Hold on. Let's go back to routines, edit, concat. Go. Okay, so I have to put 256 back in here. Okay, so let's try that again. Okay, so here's my results. I have one row coming back. The column name is test hello. The actual value is hello world.